So, welcome everybody to the INSEAD Knowledge Club Sweden event 2021. This is the fourth event of this kind organized by the Swedish INSEAD Alumni Association. And this time we are very pleased to be able to do this in cooperation with INSEAD Lifelong Learning. This has resulted in more than 900 sign-ups, which is roughly 10 times the previous events. So a very special thank you to the 12-member strong team from Ericsson, INSEAD, and my colleagues from Sweden, who have worked hard and enthusiastically to make this event possible. Send them a like. Henry Ford once said, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success." So we are keeping together now for the fourth time. So if these events also have impact on our work in companies, we may call it a success. The future will tell. Now, for those who join us for the first time, the purpose of these events is to invite INSEAD professors to talk about a current strategic international issue, critical for business and Sweden's, or your country's, economy, and then discuss that with Swedish business leaders, policymakers, and participants like yourself. So you can think of it, it's like bringing high-intensity INSEAD class discussions with top business leaders to you just a click away. The first event was in 2018 with Ilan Michov and the Dean of INSEAD, discussing with Swedish industrialist Leif Johansson, chairman of AstraZeneca, on the business as a force for good. And today we have the honor then to discussing a very hot topic, leading transformation in an age of disruption, with Peter Zemsky, professor of strategy and deputy dean at INSEAD, with a broad research in AI and strategy in a disruptive age. And we're very pleased to have Börje Ekholm, CEO of Ericsson, with us. He has managed to bring profits back to Ericsson, but also keeps warning us of the necessity for Europe to stay on top of 5G in competition with the US and China, as these networks are the basis for services expansions for many companies, and thus having a huge economic impact. This requires political actions as well. Börje is also an alumni of INSEAD. A warm welcome to you both. I would like to give the floor then to Peter Zemsky, who will make a presentation for maybe 15 minutes or so, and then lead the discussion with Börje Ekholm for another 30 minutes, taking your questions, and we will conclude around 15:10. Welcome to you all. So over to you, Peter.
All right, Eskil, it's a pleasure to be back for my second Knowledge Club of Sweden event. It is great that we can do this digitally and share your good work and the insights globally with a bigger audience, but I must say, I'm going to miss the dinner in Stockholm this evening. Maybe we can make that up another time. So as Eskil said, our topic today is leading transformation in an age of disruption. And really with the CEO of Ericsson, we have an accomplished leader who's been living in a highly dynamic sector for a long time. And really, it's just hugely rewarding as a professor to be able to learn from the alumni of the school. Especially today, as I feel the practice of management and leadership is really changing quickly. The ability to partner between faculty and alumni has never been more important. And in particular, I think we're particularly blessed with INSEAD leaders like Börje, who are, of course, are known for navigating international. But for those, as we know, INSEAD, it's more than just international. It's that deep respect for diversity, really an attention to the human part of leadership, which is so important, not only for the well-being of our people, but even to get things done today in these anxious times. It's super important. But in addition to that, I also believe that INSEAD leaders are known for their strategic acumen. Again, I say that as a strategy professor, and this includes their ability to be really creative and think differently about today's business challenges. So what Eskil asked me to do at the start here, let me here on my screen, would be to talk a little bit about the strategy context for leaders like Börje. What are we teaching today in our strategy classes in these disrupted times? Again, we can debate exactly how much more dynamic the world is. The world's always been dynamic. So the first thing, let's just get through this, the beginning, the basics first. Again, as you know, there's many different ways to think about strategy. It's not a single topic. It's not a single approach. You can, of course, think about planning. You can think about resource allocation. But one of the classic ways to think about strategy is about how do you get an organization, especially big established organizations, to adapt to their environment, to the opportunities and threats that the world is throwing up to them. This notion of fit in a dynamic environment. And then again, this is exactly, I think, the approach to strategy that typically I lead with in my teaching today. The key thing at the middle of this framework is not just about the environment and the organization, but I think one thing we've gotten really sharp about in the last 10, 15 years is understanding that at the center of effective strategy is really sharp value propositions. How is it that your company is creating value for customers, for society, in a distinctive way so you can also capture value? So that's the basic approach. And again, that had come to the forefront with all of the technology and digital disruption, but it's only reinforced, of course, by COVID, which is yet another big source of change and disruption, forcing companies in various ways to think about adapting, again, both the value propositions they bring and ultimately the hard work, their organizations. Now, when we think about COVID, one thing we always need to think about is how are different trends interacting? Especially important for COVID because we hope we see that light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully, COVID will eventually be behind us increasingly. And therefore, you want to understand, well, what are, of course, the long-term impacts? And here, people who study human decision-making, they say we tend to be overly biased to assume that current disruptions will continue. So again, some of you may be huggers, right? Remember before COVID, you would see friends, loved ones, even coworkers, and you'd throw your arms around them, make contact with them. And of course, you've had to stop that. If you accidentally try and do that today, people often back away. But what I can tell you is, you will hug again, right? We'll get COVID behind us. This behavior will bounce back. Same thing around a lot of travel. We see it today. Right? As soon as restrictions ease up, people are rushing to travel to see friends and loved ones. That's part of sort of human dynamics. And so when I think about the sustained impacts of COVID, one of the things I look for is how has COVID accelerated existing trends, things that were already bubbling up, important in 2018, 2019, that have now been accelerated. Because again, that acceleration is likely to stick. So let's take a look at a few. All right. The first one, pretty obvious. One of the reasons it's so interesting to talk to leaders like at Ericsson, clearly digital has been accelerated. People have been forced to try e-commerce, online learning, online collaboration, and there's been a whole set of trials, and much of that, of course, is going to stick, and it was already a huge trend before. Now, there are some surprises in there, I think, and we'll probably talk about this. It surprised people in one way how well remote work, online collaboration has worked, and yet, at the same time, has it, right? At the same time, the sense of human wellness, anxiety, vulnerability probably has never been greater. And so when I think about one of the other key trends from before COVID was increasing attention to businesses' impact on society. Things like the UN sustainability goals here, or today we talk about ESG. Clearly, the whole part about human wellness has been accelerated. I think Börje is joining us today from New York. If I think about my native US, we see that the fact that COVID has hit different populations very differently, it's not a surprise that there's more attention to things like inclusion, the reason that Black Lives Matter heats up in this space. And of course, it's not just fragility of humans, it also spills over. I think there's obviously much greater attention than to the fragility of the planet and sustainability. Again, things that were there before, but we expect to stick. And all of this, I think, very much plays to INSEAD. INSEAD leaders. We're good about business and society. We're good about creativity and digital. But the last broad challenge I see across sectors that's maybe more challenging for INSEAD is this push, the pushback against globalization, increasing nationalism. Again, whether it's Brexit or Trump, Islamic extremism, this clearly existed before COVID, but clearly in this crisis, in this pandemic, people have seen their national governments are more important. Governments are getting more assertive. There's more competition for say, vaccines. And this deglobalization, the pressure for resilient or localized supply chains is clearly something that we expect to get more entrenched from the pandemic. So, of course, this means for leaders, you've got to develop the organization that can respond to these trends. So we knew before the crisis, you had to do these things around digital transformation so that you could exploit these technologies. Increasingly today, you have to build organizations that can deal with some of the challenges in terms of green expectations. Okay, with that as a backdrop on a little bit the environment we're talking about, I thought we might make this interactive by pulling up a poll. So what this is going to ask you is where you sit in your country, your organization, your sector. If you had to pick 2 or 3 key why don't we pull up the poll, please? If you had to pick 2 or 3 key challenges for you. And again, if you're having trouble prioritizing, you can go to a maximum of 4. But, try and see if you can boil this down to 2 or 3 and let us know what you're thinking here. So answers are coming in. I can see this. Boom, boom, boom. Again, no right or wrong answer. We're trying to get an average across, hundreds and hundreds of people, different sectors. That will give us something for Börje and myself to chew on later. So here we go. I'm going to give you just another 5 seconds. So I think we've got a good sample. Not everyone's responded, but we're hundreds of answers. 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. End poll and share the results. So climate change as we go into COP26 at 37%. The equity, 21% on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Look at this one. This, for all the talk a few years ago about AI destroying jobs, look at that, 45% struggling to attract, retain talent. Data and AI just fueling another big wave. Digital transformation, it's not done, still going. We still, again, this new challenge of supply chains at 19%. And there you go. So let me stop sharing now. So there you go. So that's my first topic. And I just, and my second thing is, well, what's changed in terms of strategy? I mean, this is, the context has changed. We emphasize different things, more about ecosystems and partnering. But I would argue the basic tools, the approach, how do you carve out a defensible place where you have distinctive value creation? Those principles haven't changed. For me, the big change over the last decade that's just been driven home in the pandemic, it's not a change in the principles of strategy, but the process by which I see companies making strategy. So the classic thing, so for those of you alumni who studied maybe strategy with me or others a decade or more ago, this would be familiar. You'd have a fairly linear view of strategy, right? You would start by analyzing the environment, a lot of analysis, then formulating your strategy, the brilliant ideas, and then you'd hand it off to your team for execution. So that's a classic linear approach. And what's the problem with that? Again, we always knew this, but it's become very clear as soon as no matter how smart you are, no matter how much you pay your consultants, when you start to execute, you get surprised, right? Because the world is too complicated, too uncertain, too changing. So, so here's the required Dilbert cartoon that really drives this home. So the engineer, I'm thinking of getting into the strategic planning game because, right, Börje, everyone wants to do strategy. It's a high status thing. He studied it. If I understand the job description, you basically hallucinate about the future and then something different happens, right? Here in popular management culture, people are understanding that the game is a little bit empty. And then Dilbert says, you also have to pretend it's useful. Ooh, that sounds hard. Again, that's for me, the quintessential leadership challenge. On the one hand, you need to make strategy more agile. On the other hand, your people are craving certainty. They're craving a sense of direction. And so they don't want to give up on this notion of a long-term strategy. So if I was going to go back and take people that I taught early in my career, if I could change one slide in their mind, it would be this one. Instead of this linear process, what I increasingly want people to come away from their study of strategy with is to see it as a continuous process. And so, for example, and a lot of this comes out of, for those who are involved or read about the culture, the Silicon Valley playbook, what happens in startups. You have things like lean startup, where the emphasis is, okay, don't have big plans, get out there and try stuff, build solutions, then be careful, measure how those are going so that you can immediately learn and rebuild an ongoing continuous process. Like a lot of things, it's really easy to understand the principles. What's super hard is not the strategy part, but the leadership part. How do you get a culture that can actually do this? So you'll see people emphasizing fail fast, fail often. Again, I think if for those who've been around organizations, getting people to fail is not necessarily the biggest problem. My favorite one is actually this one. This is from a company founded by a couple of INSEADers, BlaBlaCar, one of the early French unicorns. As they scaled their organization and looked to maintain their culture, this is the sign they put up: fail, learn, succeed. And for me, yes, you need people who are trying things and therefore willing to fail, but really underlying a lot of these transformations is, can you build an organization where people are learning fast? I mean, the whole point of all these changes is if you're going to turn them into opportunities, you've got to be able to learn as an individual, as a team, as an organization faster than others. So, okay, that was my little warm up for the Knowledge Club of Sweden on, how we're thinking about strategy in disrupted times. Again, it's doubling down on this challenge of adapting your organization to its environment, but doing that in an agile way. And if I was going to summarize that, you've got to break down this distinction between formulation and execution. They've got to go hand in hand in a continuous way. Okay, that's my mini lecture for today. And now it's my great pleasure to invite distinguished INSEAD alum, the CEO and president of Ericsson, Börje. Please join us from New York, I believe.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Yes, I'm in New York, and my laptop didn't start, so I'm using my cell phone only. So in the kind of, maybe that's appropriate given my role.
Absolutely. Broadcasting live from 4G in New York, I imagine. So I guess maybe great to have you back at INSEAD, even if digitally. And I guess the first question is, of course, what's your answer? What would you prioritize as 2 or 3 of the top challenges that you're thinking about at Ericsson? But even in addition to that, as you go through that exercise, do you actually see a significant change in the level of uncertainty relative to what you've seen earlier in your career? I mean, you've been in dynamic sectors for a long time. Just curious about those 2 questions.
I may start with the last one, and I think you, to some extent, said the same thing. I often think that you think it's the hardest where you are right now. So take it to when you get a child, you say, okay, young children, small problems, older children, bigger problems. But the reality is, I'm not convinced of that. They're different though, but they're not necessarily bigger. And the same thing in business. They may be different today, but I'm not sure it's bigger.
Very good.
So the existential questions for businesses have always existed. No different now. So I think we're sometimes exaggerating and wishing it to be more difficult today than it was in the past, and kind of using that a bit as an excuse. So I think that's the first thing, is to stop doing that and recognize business has always had challenges and faced adversity around us. So I think that's my take. So I'm less in that camp. Then that doesn't mean it's trivial today, but it was never trivial before.
Fair enough. So then the second part, of these various transformations and challenges that people are looking at, what are some of the ones that are on really the top of your mind today?
I think we have a very, in that sense, different environment right now than just a few years back. It was hit a lot in the survey. I do believe attracting, retaining key talent is front and center of my mind. That is the only way to succeed, I believe, in the future, is to have the right capabilities in the company. That includes continuous learning, continue to develop your people, but it also includes attracting and retaining key talent. Then I would possibly add one thing which I didn't see on there, but I think, geopolitics is a much bigger question today than it has ever been. We see it, of course, directly, given the key part of the infrastructure that we sell, but it's part of a supply chain discussion. The disruptions we're seeing on global supply chains will have to be changed a bit. I do believe we will need to invest in flexibility in the supply chain in different ways. So I think geopolitics play a big role. And the last big question for society, but for all companies, is the climate crisis. Climate crisis is such a slow-moving crisis, so it has never been taken 100% seriously. I think it requires very drastic actions, and it will require actions on us as companies and have big impact on the way we conduct business, the way we take care of society and provide value to society.
Great set of topics. So let's delve in maybe briefly into each of them. Maybe let's start with geopolitics. Again, lots of sensitivities and many ways you could approach that. Maybe come at it from a European angle, right? So one of the big dynamics is some of the geopolitical tension between China and US, which are also the big tech superpowers out there. Right. Any thoughts on Europe, both what is Europe doing enough to remain competitive on tech, but also how do we think about companies and countries navigating this really fractured landscape?
Europe has a bit, I wouldn't call it an existential question, but it borders towards that, where we have to decide as Europe and Europeans where we're going to play and what role we want to play in the world. This is not necessarily a company question. We can manage that, but it's a society question and it's a governmental question. And I think that's where Europe needs to figure out, because we are falling behind. So if you look at tech unicorns, much fewer in Europe compared to China and the US. Look at cloud technologies. Look at pretty much every sector except telecommunications, where we actually happen to have two companies, right? Which is more than America, by the way. So the US depends on Europe in that sector as one of the few, which is why you see America also aggressively trying to build domestic vendors with the ORAN initiative. So it's not a pitch dark picture, but it's a picture where technology is not front and center in Europe, and Europe in a way runs the risk of not being part at the key strategic tables because we are not as strong in technology as we ought to be. And by the way, it's not for lack of educational institutions. They are, if you look at European education level, it's very high, it's very good people. I believe the entrepreneurial climate is also getting better, but it's still that almost the industrial strategy that the two superpowers are taking are not necessarily helping Europe.
Interesting. Maybe just on telecom as one of the bright lights of Europe. Are you confident about the sustainability of Europe's position, and even what does Europe need to do to sustain that leadership position? What would you like to see?
I'm not a big believer in government aids, etc. So I'm not after that at all. But what I do think is that if you as a company, you need a market that's close to your R&D, and the same thing with our fellow across the Baltic, we are fairly strong in R&D in Europe. Of course, we have R&D in the other parts of the world as well, but you need a strong home market because that actually feeds your own R&D engine. So that's where I think Europe has the big issue. We are not building out the new telecom infrastructure as fast as the rest of the world. And I think that's a strategic issue for Europe. That's really where I think, where not help, but that's where we need to think more industrially as Europe. So if Europe is to compete in technology in the future, what is needed? What are the key capabilities? What is the key infrastructure needed, etc.? That's what needs to be discussed and laid out.
Interesting. I should just to the audience, do put questions in. I'm going to keep moving, and then of course we'll come back and go deeper where you want to go deeper in a second with Luque. Maybe let's turn to talent, and maybe if you could bring together, as you said, we've got on the one hand both this increasing war for talent, scarcity of talent, and on the other hand this tricky navigation around remote work, which we have to balance both what works for you internally, but also what's going to make you attractive. Maybe what's your thinking at Ericsson? How does this play out for you? Do you see that you have to do things differently in different locations?
What we see is a change in the way many of the tech companies recruit, actually. They're allowing remote working in a very different way, and that's changing the playing field. And if we are going to attract that type of talent, we will also need to be much more flexible, which is what we have said we'll do. I still believe offices play a role and are needed, but they need to be changed and need to be looking much more as collaboration centers, innovation hubs, etc., where we can get our people together to work together, get to know each other, but then do a lot of the tasks remotely. So I do believe we're going to see that change. We would never have tested us into 100%, or as we have been 85-90% of our people working remotely. That would not have been a test we would have made unless the pandemic came. So the pandemic has also shown us that it actually worked to work remotely. What is the challenge? And that's where I think we also need to look at it is, it's actually how do we build the values? How do we build a fabric in the company remotely? And I think the challenge is to ask yourself the question, given that everyone's going to be remotely, how do we need our leaders to perform in that? How do we need to train them? How will management practices evolve in a remote setting? We have not figured that out yet, at least not as Ericsson. I think very few companies have done that. But I think that's going to be needed. So when you look at the future, you will see different leaders leading teams remotely, getting together at certain key points in a project to coordinate, collaborate, and find ways of working, and then go back again. But that has to be done under the umbrella of developing your people, your health and wellness of your people, etc. I think that management challenge and leadership challenge we have not solved yet or have a solution for.
No, I mean, even for me, teaching online is different. And it's just like leading online is different, and it takes time to adapt. There are certain things that transfer and certain things you have to unlearn, which is quite
and what you do today is you almost just take the same techniques you used and put it in front of a camera. I don't think that's going to be the solution for the future. That was a bit when the car was introduced. You had to have somebody go in front of the car and wave a flag.
Yeah.
That didn't last long, but you kind of have to realize you have to adjust.
Good. I'm going to want to open up for questions soon, but maybe I want to touch on obviously the last topic, just around sustainability and what is that? We all hear a lot about it. I guess it'd be interesting to hear, what does it mean for Ericsson? How are you, as a business leader, contributing, meeting that challenge? How do you turn it into practice in your company?
We were actually, as Ericsson, it's been at our agenda for a long time. We were one of the first to adopt the science-based targets needed for the 1.5 degrees reduction or keep the increase to 1.5 degrees. So we have been very active. And the reason for that is that we have a fundamental belief, which is that the way to solve the climate crisis is really through technology. We believe digitalization will be a key enabler to reach the targets, and it's going to be critical. And actually, for digitalization to happen, connectivity is needed. So the lowest common denominator will have to be connectivity. So without connectivity, it's very hard to digitalize. So think about as the consumer digitalized. Go back 10 years, most of us would have a DVD at home. We would probably have a set of discs. Might even have some CDs. And think about today, how much, you may have some antiques in your TV and media cabinet, but most of it is today handled through streaming with very simple devices attached to the TV or sometimes even incorporated in the TV. So that whole, we don't make photo albums anymore. That's a thing of the past. I don't know that many except professional photographers with a digital camera anymore. So the consumer have digitalized. We as enterprises have not digitalized yet in the same way. So here is a massive opportunity to digitalize the society. We are working very hard at providing the infrastructure that allows digitalization to happen. But we also recognize we need to do our thing. We need to reduce the carbon footprint ourselves. And as a matter of fact, over the last 7 years, we cut it by 70%. So we cut our own footprint in our own operation, but we're also investing heavily in making our equipment much more energy efficient. Of course, you can always argue you're killing a bird with two stones, because the reality is you get the cost benefit also by reducing energy consumption. But the investments we are making in R&D is to a very large extent targeted on energy optimization of the equipment, because we see that as a fundamental part of being a sustainable company long term.
Very nice. I like the way you illustrate this interaction of trends. Clearly, digital and sustainability can reinforce themselves very nicely. And the second thing is just from where we sit, even as educators on top of your infrastructure, clearly all of this streaming opens up a huge opportunity to deliver education at scale without travel at lower carbon footprint. So it really is, it's quite exciting. Okay, I've taken maybe too much time. Like, why don't you, come on out? And we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. Why don't you pick a few for our guest?
Yes, hi. Such a privileged position to be here and read all these great questions. I see that a lot of the audience is thinking about people as key resources and how we are in both addressing the necessary changes as organization. At the same time, we also do work more from home. So how do you manage company culture and loyalty when you're having these hybrid models with the necessary changes that needs to be done within the organizations?
That's a great question. What we have tried to do is to have our leaders interact much more with the teams, even though it's remote. At least that it's that continuous virtual interaction. But I think this is where we will have the need to adapt and find better models as companies. I will not say we're anywhere near the finish line here, but what we have done at least is to start to say we need to lead differently, and we need to have that type of continuous interaction also in a virtual world. Much harder to do, but what we have seen is that our employees, call it satisfaction scores, have actually gone up during the pandemic. I'm not sure it's sustainable, and I'm not sure it's because of actions we've taken. So I think the jury is still out, but we need to continuously involve our people in a different way, and it is through the leaderships, it's through leadership training programs, etc. That just needs to happen.
Thank you. And a quick follow-on question on the leadership. What are the questions that you challenged your leadership team with?
One is actually this whole, call it stress for our people. A lot of people, not everyone, feels very stressed working from home with different and conflicting priorities in the household. So that is one thing that we have put a lot of extra attention on. The next one is the training. It's been very easy in the current environment to put training as a way to, on the back burner. We have tried to increase that instead. So I'm challenging my people quite a lot on that. And those two, I think, we don't know yet, but we hope that will also help on retaining key talent.
Great. To then go on a bit on a general topic, we've seen there's big data and digital inequality in the world that's also been accelerated by the pandemic. And how is the industry in Ericsson viewing this?
Huge issue. This is, I'm very happy you bring it up. I think the digital divide is going to be a key factor for inclusion in the future. There will be one category with connectivity and one category without connectivity. And that's a hard part. Today, almost half of the world is actually unconnected. What we have done a couple of things. We're engaged in a couple of initiatives to work to close the divide. And that includes, even in the developed economies, we have issues on digital divide. But we're also running a big program together with UNICEF to look at connecting schools, to make sure that all schools are connected. So what we're doing as a first step is reviewing connectivity situation with schools, and we have just in the process of closing the first 1 million schools to review. After that, then we can start to think what are the alternatives. But here I want to say, everyone focuses on building fiber to the home, and you see that in many developed economies in Europe, the US, and Asia. The reality is we can close the digital divide much faster using wireless technology. We could provide mobile broadband with a very high capacity in rural areas very quickly. If the investment climate was a bit more favorable. What we see typically around the world is you subsidize fiber build out and you tax cellular build out through spectrum fees and through very difficult regulation in many ways. So I think we as an industry, we can actually play a very big role in closing one of the key issues for us as society.
That would be fantastic. Peter, you interrupt. I mean, I can just go on here.
No, do one more, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, perfect. So maybe staying on this broader perspective, what do you see are the advancing trends in digital and data transformation with regards to inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, this is also a challenge where I'm hoping. I actually think digital technologies are the most level playing field, because it doesn't consider where you sit, who you are, what your characteristics are, whether you're man, woman doesn't matter, whether you're European, American doesn't matter, whether you're skin color doesn't matter, sexual orientation doesn't matter. It's actually one that creates a lot of equal playing field. We have not, as companies, done well here. We're still heavily biased. If I look at, for example, gender composition, we're better at ethnicity, but we're not good on gender composition. I think we have a work here to do in a technology that I think ultimately should be completely gender neutral. But if we start to look at education institutions, it's still very heavily male oriented, but I think also it's starting to change. I have 2 daughters studying computer science, so I have some problems there. But I do think that's where we have to, as companies, make sure that we treat talent in a way that maximizes our chances to succeed, and that means making it much more inclusive.
Maybe I'll pick up on the education sector. Just some people are asking, are you getting the talent and the right skills coming out of universities, technical, but also be interested on the business school front? Are you getting the kind of diversity you need? So curious what your views are on education systems in Europe, in the US, and different markets.
I would say I think the level of education is good. I don't think it's the problem is the quantum coming out. It's not the quality. So we need to train more people, and I think it's often spoken about the job losses that are going to come out of automation. They're going to be, in tens of millions of job losses, but there will be more jobs created from automation. I'm convinced of that. But the problem is it will be different skill set. So I think the quantum in universities will need to change towards more of, call it computer science, mathematics, STEM subjects. I don't know what you would label it. I think that's going to be more. I don't think we should or want to have only STEM people out there. That's not my point. But we need to increase the quantum there. Otherwise, we will run into shortages in a very similar way to the semiconductor industry. Right? That's also a supply problem more than anything. And I think that's the same thing on universities, actually. If you look at business schools, I think the big challenge will actually be a lot of the processes where we have had business educated or business majors will actually not exist in the future. So if you think about many of the financial areas, many of accounting, auditing, they will all be solved better by automation. Mm-hmm. So I think here we will need to train MBAs also in a different way, much more comfortable with technology as a key enabler. And that's where I think some of these education areas, business being one, where I think it has to evolve. What we're doing today will probably not be the right thing in 10 years.
No, I mean, certainly for us, I mean, more on data automation, all of it, not just the pure tech side is going to be huge.
No, and I use technology a bit sloppily. I actually think it's much more on AI and that whole how you leverage your data capabilities in a company, etc. It's not really. I don't believe everyone will be computer science. That's not what I'm after. Again, everyone will need to be comfortable how you access and use data.
It's actually interesting. I like what you brought up earlier about the job losses. I like it. One of the polls I run is what worries you about technology. And a few years ago, just as we were trying to get people to embrace AI and data, the biggest fear was job losses because the media had so much overplayed the sort of disrupting humanity. Whereas today, here we are, it's like at the bottom of the list. People are much more worried about screen addiction, about cyber. And again, I do think maybe 10 years from now, maybe it'll be different. But certainly today, the job creation is at least as big as the job destruction is what we're seeing.
But the problem is it's different jobs, right? So for the individual, I think it's a bigger issue. And that's where society will need to, or governments will probably need to step in and kind of help on that as well. We as companies, we can invest in education, upskilling, training, etc. But I don't think it will be enough to solve on the individual level, where I'm more after this as an issue.
Yeah. No, I just to link that. One thing that concerns me is just the level of anxiety in society, and you see that spilling into the political system. And I do think part of what can fuel that is economic insecurity, among other things. So it's clear we have to pay attention to that. Maybe to make things personal a little bit, maybe just talk about your own career progression. So if a few things, what do you think of key decisions you made or experiences you had that allowed you to become CEO of such an important company, and even to make it more challenging as you think about that? What would be different for the person who's going to be sitting in this seat a decade from now? How does the formation of leaders potentially need to evolve?
Great questions, and that's where academic research will provide the assistance, right?
Yes, we'll try. This is me doing academic research to see. I know it's a tough one, but
no. But if you look at key decisions that has helped me, I think one, I choose to go engineering track. So I'm an engineer, and that's a very important decision that has served me quite well over the years. Not so much that I work as a technologist or an engineer, but it has provided a reference. So that for me has been important. I would say that I attended INSEAD was very important. Not saying that to flatter you, but the reality is it changed the perspectives on decisions for me. And that is actually the global nature, as well as I would say the strategic orientation of the school, not so much the technical capabilities. I think that you need to get, it's a toolbox, but it doesn't make you a carpenter, as I say. But it at least gives you the ability to do certain things. But the whole perspective, the international environment, makes you more appreciating how you have to include people, how you need to make sure that you consider all aspects of a decision. I think that has served me very, very well, and I'm truly appreciating that part of my background.
Very good. Actually, then, if we look forward, again, what I hear you describing is the ability to combine technical comfort, knowledge with business acumen, and to do that in a way that respects diversity and inclusion. That doesn't necessarily sound different from what we're going to need in the next decade. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. What I think will have changed is we will have come much further on the digitalizing our, the way we work and our workplaces. So I think the leadership challenge will be very different. But I don't think the inherent components of leadership will be different.
Very good. Okay, yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same in a way.
What becomes constant is the ability to adjust, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm looking at some of the questions. So there are, of course, some people on the call quite interested in your sector. So, I mean, you talked about, the ability to solve digital divide, but when you think about all the buzz around IoT combined with AI, and what are some of the things, the technologies in your sector that we should be watching, that people maybe outside of it are not as aware of?
Let me take one example, which I think it's a bit illustrative. We took a decision in 2018 when the whole debate about geo-resiliency in the supply chain started. It was really before anything was done, but we decided to build a much smaller factory in North America. So we have a manufacturing footprint with fairly big plants, like in Estonia, we have in China, we have in India, in Brazil, and they are large factories. So we decided to build a new one, saying that not so much other thoughts, but we need just to be close to customers and be much more flexible in the world if supply chains start to be disrupted. So we built this factory and we said we are going to do it with leveraging all latest technologies. So we put in a 5G network in the factory, which has allowed us to do a number of things. So, for example, we have a complete digital twin of the factory, allowing us to make all the changes. It creates much more flexibility. And given that we don't have any communication wires anymore, we can actually be very flexible in the way we change the production flow in there and adjust to different types of demand and make upgrades. And we can test on the digital twin before it's made in production. So that is one key. The other is when we started the factory actually in the middle of the COVID. Normally we would have sent our operators to our other factories around the world to train. But now we used AR, VR technologies instead, so they could work on the existing plants and actually knew how the machines would operate before they were installed. So our startup was much faster. And if we look now at what we've achieved is we're almost twice the labor productivity in Texas than we are in our other factories. And we use a quarter less energy, 3/4 less water. And that's all leveraging new technology. So I think what is to keep out, and now it's part of the WEF's Lighthouse program and Lighthouse factories. But what's interesting is not so much our own experience as what that can tell you about future of manufacturing. So if you think about the green impact, instead now of shipping big boxes with radios all around the world, we ship small components and actually can be much closer to the installation with the big bulky shipping. So the carbon footprint of that total supply chain is also much lower. So we're kind of a cost benefit, an environmental benefit. So I do think that's something to watch out for and actually start think about is, should one change the manufacturing footprint in this new world?
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, no, it's amazing how, as you describe it, the technology was there. Now we have this push for resilience and this push for green, and it all comes together to, unlock potentially a big shift in manufacturing. Do you want to just comment? It's a very nice snapshot of a nice success. Any comments on what you're doing currently? Are you doubling down on decentralization, or how are you seeing things going forward?
We are continuing to look into that if we should make further changes to our existing footprint. It's a bit of lead time on that. But the learning experience in a way have given us reasons to say, okay, given the macro trends, it's back to the geopolitics, climate change. Given those, how should we think about it? When we built the factory in the US, we said it's going to increase costs, right? It actually hasn't. But we didn't know that.
It's funny. Yeah, you have to try sometimes. The assumptions don't always plan out. That's super interesting. I don't know if there's something here, but I was intrigued by one question around space. Obviously, space has always been part of your industry, but things are heating up with SpaceX and stuff. Is this the advance in space technology? Is that stuff that has implications for you? Is it something you're watching?
It will have it, and we're also watching that. And we will see, again, it's back to the question of digital divide. There are many parts of the world which will be very difficult to cover with terrestrial technologies. So simply satellite will be the means to provide those coverage. You will also make sure, if you think about the supply chain, for example, you need continuous coverage from the endpoints in order if you want to digitalize it fully. So there are many areas where I think satellite technology will play a very important role going forward. No question in my mind. So we see that as one of the trends we need to both work in and watch out for.
Very nice. Eskil, I'm going to be handing back to you in a second. I'm just going to pick one more question from the audience that particularly appeals to me. How do you motivate your people to stay curious and eager to learn? And also to understand what you personally might do. I mean, you must be super busy. How do you make time? How do you try and learn and stay current?
What we have tried to embark on in a journey at Ericsson is to move the accountability for staying current to the individual. And I often say that I want 100,000 CEOs at Ericsson. I want them all to be responsible for their own career and their own development, because that's the best way to stay current. As a company, we may know some things and we may provide the different programs, but it's really only you as an individual that can be motivated to learn from it. So for me, that's been one of the key ways to drive this. It's still, we're a few years down a journey that's going to be 5 to 10 years, but we're seeing a change in the way that now people are feeling that it's up to me if I'm relevant tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And that to me is something I'm quite happy with. We need to provide the tools. We need to provide the training courses, etc., for them to stay current. But it at least gives that opportunity to take a few hours a week to actually make sure that you train yourself and you educate yourself.
One of the things I love about online course, like traditional exec ed, you fly everyone together. It's an intense week. And it's great. I mean, it's very powerful, but online allows you to build courses where people spend 3 to 4 hours with you every week learning. And my hope is that gets them in the habit of that. And I think that's super important. I would say though, we work on both sides. One hand is exactly what you say. How can we provide, a hub with a set of solutions and people can customize? But then there's also that part where you try and give, use the technology to give a whole leader, hundreds of people the same language to also build the communication and the collaboration. So it's an interesting one. This sort of personalization versus the learning at scale is interesting. Eskil, I think we've had a very good conversation. So why don't you come in and maybe if you have a last question or two, and we can wrap this up.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This is quite exciting discussion. Yeah, we have a minute for a question. Maybe it's what struck me very much, with your talk, Börje, was this sort of human's constant ability to lead. This kind of basic things that remain the same, but the new resources are given, right? And we have to learn how to use them. So this adaptability. But how would you characterize in one phrase? What are these sort of key elements of leadership that goes through time?
Yeah, it's a good question, Eskil. I think what has served me well, at least, and one is transparency. I believe transparency is critical. That then people don't have to read between the lines because it simply doesn't say anything. And then you try to remove speculation. You will always have speculation, but transparency kind of forces integrity in decision making. It forces honesty, and you know what goes on. I think that's a quality that will be needed in the future as well, and it doesn't doubt. I also think I call it ability to, it's an analytical ability. I think that will be critical as well. We are not, as humans, we're not going to know everything. We will be in uncertainty. So we need to think in different scenarios, in different developments. That comes of some sort of basic analytical insights and analytical views. I think those are going to be critical as well in the future. What I think will be maybe more important is the aspect of how do you look at each individual. So I think, in a way, empathy is going to play a bigger role in leadership going forward, because I think we have to recognize it's all about motivating people to do the right thing. It's not going to force to put a, call it, process or rules or regulations in place. You need those as well. But I think the focus on the individual will probably be even more important going forward. And something not discussed as much, I think, in general, call it management training. We talk more about processes and procedures than we talk about how do we view each individual? How do we make sure each individual is a talent for the organization? How do we think about that? To give you a bit different perspective.
Well, thanks. That was three very, very nice perspectives. I really appreciate that. It reminds me of a Nobel laureate I listened to once, actually, who had this medical guy, and he had discovered this. There was something fundamental that has always worked, and we hadn't just sort of fixed these things as things go on. So thanks for putting the human perspective on it. So now the last minutes here, to wrap up, then I just have one question to you to sum it up a little bit. I'll start with Börje, like 2-3 minutes. And the question is, why are you optimistic about the future? So you can see this tone in your style.
I'm very optimistic. I think tomorrow will be better than yesterday. I'm convinced of that. And I do believe technology plays a role. I'm a big believer in technology as a force for good. There are complications with technology. We should not underestimate those. Think about AI can be used in the wrong ways, etc. But I think those can be harnessed and actually controlled for a much better future. So I believe that in the next decade we're going to solve the climate problem. I think that's a big achievement. That will be solved. Digitalization will be one thing, but we will see other things. Electrification of transport, etc. So there are several of these things that will be solved with technology the coming decade, which we've actually been suffering from the last 100 years. So I think that will be solved. I do believe we will have a much more inclusive society going forward, because we are going to allow everyone a better access to better education, higher education through closing the digital divide, for example. We're going to close the banking divide. A large part of the world's population is unbanked. With the new digital tools, we're going to see them being able to access banks as well. So I think when we look 10 years from now, it will be a better world.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a great summary. And great to have your opinion about this. So I will ask the same question to you, Peter. Why are you optimistic? I mean, you are born optimistic, I can tell, I know. But why are you optimistic about the future?
Similar, but I guess, Plato long ago said necessity is the mother of invention. And there's a lot of, climate change is a necessity. We have to deal with that. And just these challenges that we face, I completely agree with Börje. With technology, we have the tools. We have the toolbox to solve these issues. And now it should draw out sort of the best of humanity to come up with these solutions and meet these pressures. The one asterisk for me, because I'm not, I also try and be a realistic. One of the there's some big governance problems to solve, including at the political level. Some of these problems, cannot just be dealt with at the company level, and there's stresses on the political system in many countries. And so part of the intervention we need to do is at an institutional level that involves business and society. So that's going to be a big one. But even there, I'm optimistic that we'll get there eventually.
Okay, so on this note of optimism then, and a little caution there on governance, I would like to thank to you, Peter and Börje, very much for this very rewarding discussion, very dynamic, and all of you who joined this event. And if you could flip on the next slide there at the end. There, yes. So to get information, final thought here, to get information on future INSEAD Knowledge Club Sweden events, you're welcome to sign up on the left on the link here, on the slides, or on the NNA Sweden webpage. And you can stay in touch with of course, with the INSEAD Lifelong Learning, which is open to all, alumni and non-alumni, on INSEAD EDU. So thank you all, and goodbye for now.
Very good. Thank you, Eskil, for organizing another great event. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Luque, for the questionings. And Börje, great to have you back at INSEAD.
Thank you. Good to see you all.